What's happening, fishing friends? The lakes and ponds should be free of ice pretty soon around here, so that means it was time to get some fresh line on some of my combos. As I was spooling up, I thought about a conversation I had with one of my subscribed fishing friends not long ago, and he was asking me, Debo, what are the real advantages of using a lighter line? I thought, you know what, that would be a great video to go over for people that are newer to bass fishing or for folks that have never really thought about it. They just always went to the store and grabbed something, 15-pound, whatever. So I put together the 7 advantages that come to mind for me when you're using lighter fishing line. Now before we get into the video, I want to ask all of you out there to keep the folks here in the Midwest in your thoughts. If you haven't caught it on the news, there's some horrendous flooding going on around here. Our town hasn't really been horribly affected by it, a little bit, but a number of years back we had a horrible flood. It was past our 500-year flood plan. It was literally 3 blocks away from my house. You went down 3 blocks and there was water all the way up over street signs. People that lived in single-story houses, it was all the way up to their roof. It's awful. Everything those folks have worked for so hard in their life, gone in a day's time. So I just ask that you all keep them in your thoughts. I hate seeing that kind of stuff. It happens. You honestly forget how destructive Mother Nature can be. So the first advantage of using lighter fishing line is that lighter fishing line is going to cast farther and cast easier for you. Anytime you go to buy a new combo, it can be a complete conundrum trying to decide what type or size of line you're going to spool that reel up with. Let's say you went to the store and picked up 17-pound mono because it was the first thing you saw and it looked good. Try dropping that down to a 12 or 10-pound if you can get away with it. Remember that the lighter you go online, the more susceptible it's going to be to breaking if you get any sort of abrasion on it, rub it up against a rock or a tree. It's more susceptible to breaking because it has a smaller diameter. But because it's smaller, you're going to be able to cast farther with it. So if you're someone who's just getting into bass fishing and you've spooled up with 17 or 20-pound monofilament on your baitcaster, you might try dropping down. You'd be surprised how much and how easier lighter line will cast a farther distance. The second big advantage to using a lighter line is that it's harder for fish to see. Now hold on, I've got a bunch of people that went to hit the thumbs down because they're like, Debo, it doesn't matter, but hear me out. We could do a complete whole nother video on can fish see line, what size. Whole nother video. But hear me out. I believe that the lighter, less visible lines can play an important part depending on the water clarity and what type of bait you're using. I think the benefits of using lighter line are most prevalent when you're using a slower finesse approach where that bass is really getting a good look at it, really keying in on it, deciding if it wants to eat it or not. And that's even amplified if you're in really clear water. Take, for example, a drop shot. Now I cringe saying that word. I know I'm not good at it, but a drop shot, I think, can really be affected by lighter line that fish can't see because you're dangling that drop shot there, dragging it, barely moving it. That fish is getting a good look at it before it eats it, especially if you're in clear water. Drop shotting is really popular in clear water. That bass is going to get a good look at it. Now, if you take, for example, a chatterbait in real muddy water, or you take a topwater frog where you're popping that frog and working it, and the top of the water is disturbing. Those fish really aren't going to see that braid, especially if you're a bunch of slop or pads. It's not going to make a huge difference. So can fish really see the line? I don't know, honestly, if they can, but here's the way I look at it. Let's say I'm fishing next to a guy and I get 3 more bites using a lighter line than he does using straight braid. You might say 3 bites, big deal, maybe even 2 bites. So what, Debo, you got 2 more bites, who cares? Well, one of those bites could be a personal best. So if I can get away with using a lighter line and get 2 more bites than the guy fishing next to me, I'll go with lighter line all day. Now, the third big advantage to using lighter line is that lighter line has less of an impact on the bait. And some folks will argue that this is the real reason that lighter line gets more bites, not because fish can or can't see it, but because it has less impact on the bait. It lets that bait move more naturally, more freely. And I completely agree. The more natural a bait looks, I think a bass is more likely to eat that. If something that's moving around all funky because the line's all twisted up, bass is like, no, it doesn't go. Again, going back to the drop shot, take, for example, a drop shot like this. Have you ever tried putting a bait like this on 20-pound line? It's not going to sit very straight and it's going to want to curl. It's going to move kind of weird because that line is so heavy. Put it on something like this, some light 6-pound line, it's going to look a lot more natural. So the lighter you go with your line, it's going to allow that bait to move freer. The line's going to have less impact on it and it's going to look natural. Now, speaking about how the line makes that lure move, that brings us to our 4th advantage, lure depth control. If you're trying to get a crankbait or a jerkbait to dive deeper, say you're using 15-pound fluorocarbon, and it's not getting down as far as you want, you drop that baby down to 8 or 10-pound and that bait's going to get down deeper. You will see on a crankbait package here, crankbaits oftentimes have like a little chart there where it shows how deep that lure is going to dive. If you were to throw this jerkbait on 20-pound fluorocarbon, it's not going to get deep. Maybe it'll get to that 2 feet depth. But if you throw this exact same little jerk bait on, say, some 10-pound fluorocarbon, this jerk bait's going to get way closer to that maximum depth. That thinner diameter line has less resistance in the water, less impact on the bait. It allows this bait to do its thing and get down deeper. And that's good because you can use it to your advantage. Let's say you're fishing a square bill in some real shallow water and it keeps digging the bottom, you're getting leaves and stuff. Let's say you're throwing it on some real light fluorocarbon. 10-pound fluorocarbon is what you have. Well, if you put that same square bill on some 17 or 20-pound fluorocarbon, that square bill is going to come up. It's not going to be digging down in the bottom, so it's very useful. Same thing, again, if you're using a jerk bait and trying to keep it just over some grass. If you keep getting all the way down in the grass using 10-pound, bump that up to 15 or 17, and you should be able to stay above it. Now, speaking of fishing in shallow water, when you go to shallow water, generally you drop down to a lighter bait, right? It allows it to fall a little bit slower. You're not, hitting bottom right away and digging into stuff. You tend to go lighter in some instances. Say, for example, you're throwing a little 3/16 ounce jerk bait, in a little pond or something. It's going to be hard to throw that jerk bait on 20-pound fluorocarbon. So the fifth big advantage is that lighter line will help you cast lighter lures easier. There's a reason crappie anglers don't load up on 65-pound braid when they're fishing little crappie jigs, right? A tinier, thinner diameter line doesn't require as much weight or as much force to pull it off the spool. So if you're throwing a real small jig, it's going to be easier to cast that jig. It's going to come off the reel easier when you have a lighter line. Now, that's not the only thing that comes into play when you're casting a lighter lure. If you drop down to a softer rod, a lesser power rod, if you're trying to throw it on a medium heavy, it's going to be real tough. But you drop that down to an ultralight, you're going to be able to cast that little 3/16 ounce jig a lot easier. So besides lighter line, rod, there are multiple things that come into play, but using a lighter line will definitely help you cast smaller, lighter lures easier. Speaking of lighter power rods, if you're somebody who likes to finesse fish, you're oftentimes going to, a medium light spinning rod, right? Well, lighter line may be necessary in those scenarios to ensure you're not damaging your equipment. That's the sixth big advantage. Line ratings on a rod are meant to suggest the normal breaking strength of a line that can be paired with that rod on a properly adjusted reel. As you can see, this little spinning rod, this is going to be my drop shot setup, is rated for 6 to 12-pound line. If I were to put 65-pound braid on here and I'm fighting a fish, I don't have my drag set correctly, that line is going to hold strong. My rod is most likely going to break before 65-pound braid is on an ultralight or a medium light, whatever type spinning rod. So that's why you want to make sure you have a proper line paired with the proper rod. Now, besides the rod itself breaking, oftentimes, a smaller rod, an ultralight type rod, is not going to have as big or heavy duty eyes or, guides on it. You could be damaging those, you could break them off, whatever it is. So that's why you always want to pay attention to the line rating. Now, not always. If you have a heavy power rod that's rated for 25-pound line, that baby's probably going to be all right to frog on and use braid. But there are certain rods that are going to be set up for that. Again, they might have different type of guide inserts, all kind of different things. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to try to pair the right size of line to your rod. All right, that brings us to the seventh and final advantage to using lighter line. You can fit more line on the reel spool. Different line types have different diameters, and this can kind of be confusing for newer anglers because, again, if you look at a 20-pound monofilament and compare that to a 20-pound braid, 20-pound braid is going to have a lot thinner diameter, and you're going to be able to get a lot more on your reel than you would a 20-pound mono. And being able to fit more line on your reel really comes into play if you're trying to make really long casts. If you're using a real big, thick, heavy line, you're not going to be able to cast as far. It's not going to hold as much. You might get to the end of the spool if you're using a low-profile baitcaster. Or if you're somebody that's getting a spinning reel ready and you're going to use the drag on the reel to fight big fish, you don't want to have just a little bit of line on there. That fish takes off and spools you and snaps your line. You want to be able to keep a high capacity on there in case it runs. Now, the nice thing about most reel manufacturers is they'll put that on the reel for you. You can see here, this is that Bass Pro Qualifier 2 that I picked up. They put on here the braid rating, the monofilament rating, and it shows how much this reel can hold. And this is a pretty cool comparison to look at. You can see on the box that it says, for 14-pound monofilament, it'll only hold 95 yards. But if I look at that same rating under braid, it holds 100 yard of 50-pound braid. So you can see that the braid has a much smaller diameter. The reel's going to be able to hold more. So fishing friends, that is it. Those are my top 7 advantages to using lighter line. But I want to hear from all of you, so comment below and let me know. What do you think the advantages of using lighter line are? Is it something that I covered, or is it something completely different that maybe I didn't even think about? Let me know. Take, for example, my man Russell over at RWA Fishing. He's always commenting on my videos. He's a good guy. He's got his own YouTube channel. I'll link his channel down below. Go check it out and show him some love. But he's always leaving a comment that makes me think, something how he does it, or, a different way of doing it. So it's awesome getting stuff like that because people get thinking, they're helping one another. People are leaving comments saying, hey, Debo does this, but try this. That's what it's all about. It's about learning and having fun along the way. So that's it. Of course, it is late. I got to get going to bed. Until next time.